Hi, we're out on the range today, so please bear with gunfire and whatever other nonsense you might hear in the background. But fair warning, all I'm going to do today is talk, so some people will say that you would also have to bear with whatever nonsense you hear in the foreground. But what we're talking about today is, a while ago I did a presentation on how to spot a fake expert, and I listed my top 5 ways to recognize someone who's trying to convince you or convince themselves that they know a lot more about firearms than they really do. Well, that brought up the question, how do you spot a real expert? Now that's a very interesting question, so here we are. Now I don't have a top 5 list, but I do have a top 3 list of ways you can recognize a genuine firearms expert. But first, let's recap over the 5 ways to see a fake expert. First is the person who speaks authoritatively about things that not only does he not know, but he's not in a position that he would know. A good example is somebody says, a Volkswagen Beetle is really good to drive in the snow, even though he doesn't own one, has never driven one, has never ridden in one, at least not in the snow, hasn't done any online research or book research on the topic. He not only doesn't know, but he's not in a position where he even would. Second on the list is the ballistics chart guy. He quotes chapter and verse from the ballistics chart, but he doesn't seem to appreciate that when you get off the chart and into reality with environmental factors and different barrel lengths and different types of firearms, that ballistics chart is not always the end-all be-all source of information. Third is the just as powerful guy. Side note, hey Jim, how you remember that guy's name this much later is beyond me. But to get back on task, number 4 is the guy who speaks in great detail about all the firearms he has that he doesn't really have. And number 5 on the list, which really is number 1, are people who use any of the different versions of there's no such thing as. For example, you tell a fake expert, I have a Smith & Wesson Model 14, and he might say, there's no such thing as a Smith & Wesson Model 14, or no, you mean a Model 15, or no, Smith & Wesson never made a Model 14. However you word it, it's some version of there's no such thing as. Now when I say that, people will say things to me like, so when someone says he has a phase plasma rifle in 40-watt range, I should believe him? Okay, that's what we call ad absurdum. Now, you can go look that up, but for those of us who are still back here in the realm of plausibility and reality, firearms have been made for several centuries in well over 100 countries. They've been made for military or hunting or specifically for target shooting applications. There's customization and wildcatting. The world of firearms is so complex and so diverse, there's no way someone could know everything about it. And it becomes hubris to just assume that there's no such thing as. Which brings me to the number 1 way to spot a real expert. Real experts, knowing that you can't know everything, will frequently say things like, I don't know, or I've never heard of that. And the way you tell a real expert is how they deal with learning something new or hearing about something that they've never seen or never heard of. Such as when you say, I have a Smith & Wesson Model 14, as where the fake expert will tell you there isn't such a thing. A real expert is probably aware that the Model 15 was at one time very common, depending on which source you read, was made by the hundreds of thousands. But because the Model 14 is by comparison quite obscure, a real expert has quite possibly never heard of it. But rather than tell you, no, you can't read the numbers on your gun, he'll say, did you say a Model 14? Yes. Now I'm familiar with the Model 15, but how is the 14 different? You see the difference between that and no such thing as? A good example is you tell a fake expert, I have a 24 gauge shotgun. He'll tell you, no, you mean a 20 gauge. Another version of there's no such thing as. As where a real expert's reply might be, did you say 24 gauge? Yes. Now I'm familiar with the 20 gauge or the 28 gauge. I've never heard of a 24. Is this a really old gun? And is it a cartridge gun? Yes. Is 24 gauge stamped on the barrel? No, I just know that because my grandpa told me. Okay, that's a red flag that it might not be what you think it is. But a real expert, rather than telling you that you don't know what you're talking about, he'll say, okay, and did you do anything personally to determine it really is a 24 gauge? What would I do? And here's where a real expert will probably have a few suggestions, such as, try fitting a 20 gauge shell in there, and if it doesn't fit because it's too big, then yes, it is a 24 or a 28. Try to put a 28 in there, and if it fits, then it's a 28, but if it's loose and it falls down past the extractor, then it might be a 24 gauge. Then a real expert might say that you could get some impression compound and take an impression of that chamber and then measure it, or if you have the right tool, you can measure the chamber. This is the difference between a fake and real expert, is how a real expert deals with something he's never heard of before. Which brings me to the next topic, is that real experts will very rarely deal in absolutes. They will try to avoid using words like all and none, or always and never. Again, because the world of firearms is so complex that as soon as you say, this is the way a certain thing is, someone's going to be able to show you something that's an exception to that. A really good example is the M1 Garand, or some people will pronounce it Garand. Tomato, tomato, Caribbean. But if you say to a fake expert, hey, what caliber is an M1 Garand? It's a 30-06. Because he's unaware that they actually are available in other calibers. As where a lot of real experts are aware that there was a point where the American government rebarreled a whole bunch of M1s to 7.62 NATO and then sold them to foreign countries. I've actually seen an M1 Garand that was caliber 270. Some of which you might think, why? Well, I asked the owner of the rifle that very question, and what he told me was that as a kid he had a 270, he really loved the cartridge, he already had several rifles in that caliber, so when he got an M1 Garand, he just rebarreled it to 270. Okay. But that's why real experts don't like to talk in absolutes. Now, the third thing on my list is a little bit harder to explain, and it is somewhat subjective. And that is that a real expert looks the part, but he doesn't look like he's in costume. And no, the irony is not lost on me that I say that while I dress like this. But those of you who've met me in person know that in my daily life, this is how I dress pretty much every day. Now let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. In the city that I live in, they have something called Friday Market. They'll block off some streets downtown and people will sell handicrafts and locally grown produce. And a few weeks ago I was there and I saw somebody wearing those 509 or 513 tactical pants. Yeah, like it matters. And he's wearing those, and he's also wearing a black t-shirt that has some kind of, looks like a Special Forces logo, but it's not on the sleeve. And he's wearing these shoes that are supposed to look like military issue footwear, but they're not. They're the low top street hikers or whatever you call them. This is somebody who is in costume. He's not a real expert that dresses that way out of practicality. This is how I would expect someone who is aged 17 to 23 to dress, because he wants you to know that this is what he does and he's a real expert at it. But this guy was well into his 50s. He's in costume. Now this brings up the question, okay, well, what kind of pants do I wear? Fair enough, let me show you. These are Duluth Trading Company Flex Fire Hose work pants. They're rugged, they're durable, they have a lifetime guarantee, they have all kinds of pockets, they're very practical, but the number one reason I wear them is because they stretch and they can move with me. Now, when it comes to the fashions worn by real experts, something I would say is indicative of a very high level of expertise is when someone wears an old ratty worn-out hunting coat. But you know, there are people who disagree with that opinion. There are also people of the opinion that the way you can spot a fake expert is that he looks exactly like me. Okay, that's funny, but only when you're one of the first 100 people to say it. When you're number 101, it just becomes trite and derivative. But I do want to discuss a little bit about some of the features of a real expert's handgun that he uses. And I've got what might be called some outdated examples, but many people would consider me an outdated example, and I think I can still make the point. Now this is a Smith & Wesson Model 15 in caliber 38 Special. It's a double-action revolver with a 6-shot cylinder to 4-inch barrel. If you're familiar with this model, you may notice that these are not the original grips. I traded out the original grips for something larger that fits my hand better. Same story with this Ruger Security 6. It is very common that real experts will make very few modifications to their firearm, with the exception of trading out the original grips for a different grip that fits their hand better. let me tell you an anecdote. When I was a little kid, my father was a police officer, and this is the revolver that he carried, except he had the original grips on it. I put the larger ones on later. As far as I could tell, everyone that he worked with had the original grips on their revolver except one. There was one member of the department that had traded out those original grips for larger Packmar grips. The person that did that also won several state championships for police shooting competitions. It is very common that real experts change the grips on their handgun. Now I'm going to show you another handgun that I think is indicative of amateur hour. And before I do this, when I show you this handgun, there will be many people who get upset and they will feel insulted and they'll send me hate mail. There's a punchline at the end of this, so I would say watch this next part in its entirety before you send me any hate mail. Something that's indicative of someone with very little experience or expertise. A Glock Model 22 in caliber 40 Smith & Wesson. At the time when 40 Smith & Wesson was the newest, latest, coolest thing, there were a lot of people that went out and got that caliber for no reason other than being chronocentric people who wanted to get the newest, latest thing. There's also, who was that guy that said that all handguns should be Glocks? Yeah. Well, he has a lot of sycophants that will do things just because he says so, not really stopping and thinking about it for themselves. And you'll see people who buy Glocks because a Glock is a Glock, and being a Glock is just a Glock, and I have to get a Glock because it's a Glock, and it's a Glock. And sadly, I've actually heard somebody say words to that effect. And so a lot of people will buy a Glock without really even thinking about it. Now, on the other side of that, let me show you a firearm that is indicative that it's being used by someone with a very high level of expertise. A Glock Model 22 in caliber 40 Smith & Wesson. The thing is, Glocks are reliable and, within the parameters of what they're designed for, accurate. They are good quality pistols. They are issued by police departments, and a real expert is issued a gun like this and he'll use it without any modifications because he doesn't need to make modifications to make up for his lack of expertise. Except if he has a particularly very large hand, there are things you can do with the grip to make it a little bit bigger. Again, let me tell you an anecdote. A long time ago, when a lot of my crew was still using revolvers, and those of us who had autoloaders usually had 1911s, and my carry gun was a Steyr GB, that's a 9mm autoloader with an 18-shot magazine. My friend Joe, and in case you haven't heard of Joe, yes, he really is a real person, he bought a Glock 17. A 9mm with a 17-shot magazine, and then he immediately traded out those stock 17-shot magazines for aftermarket 19-shot magazines. I guess he was concerned that he might run into a problem that he couldn't solve with 17 rounds, but he could solve with 19. And that's the kind of modifications that people with low levels of skill will make to compensate for those low levels of skill. Now, in Joe's particular case, a lot of that had to do with, since I had a 9mm with an 18-shot magazine, he didn't want to be outdone by having only 17 rounds, so he had to get a 19-shot magazine. And a lot of real experts will make very few modifications, no modifications, as where amateurs trying to compensate for something will add Spacely sprockets and Cogswell cogs. They'll stick the machine that goes ping on there. And that is something very indicative of someone's level of expertise. Now you have to balance that against things like some people have guns because they inherited them. Some people have other guns because that's what they could afford. Some people have certain guns because that's what's legal in their jurisdiction. So don't be too quick to judge people. So to recap, the three main ways to see a real expert are how they deal with the unknown, they will avoid using absolutes, and they look the part but don't look like they're in costume. So if you've sat and watched this entire thing, thank you for your attention. If your top 3 list is different than my top 3, I'd love to hear about it. And thanks for watching the How to Spot a Real Expert video.